Hello, it's Scott Manley here. Today we had a very successful but very dramatic flight of Starship and Super Heavy on what will be known as IFT-10. It has been a disappointing couple of days up until this moment because we had a couple of times where we were going through the countdown and SpaceX decided that things were no-go. The weather has just been very insistent on getting in the way. We've had very large thunderstorms nearby, leading to violation of flight rules, which meant that we got down to literally T-minus 40 seconds, where it sat there for a couple of minutes in the hope that the weather conditions would improve so the anvil rule would not be violated, but instead, no, they turned it into a wet dress rehearsal. But yeah, today, Tuesday, it flew and it was absolutely spectacular. It took off with all the engines running in its typical loud, obnoxious fanfare that we all loved. We had some amazing photos around Max Q, which they just cut away from. Can you believe it? John Krause, of course, got an amazing photo of it going through Max Q. But pretty pictures were really just a side effect. This mission was about testing new capabilities so that they could actually proceed into orbit. This flight, they wanted to get into a suborbital trajectory, they wanted to deploy some test Starlink satellites, perform an engine burn to demonstrate that they could relight the engine for deorbiting, and then test their heat shield. Because in every one of the last 3 flights, we've heard the engineers talking about how they are testing new stuff with the heat shield, trying to remove sections of material to see how it handles things, trying new materials in some places, and all of this they have been unable to test because they have not made it through re-entry in a stable attitude. The previous flight had made it successfully to orbit, but a device called the diffuser box on top of the propellant tanks, it was leaking. So this is a system that sits on top of the tanks and it feeds in ullage gas to keep the tanks pressurized. Well, that was leaking into the nose cone, therefore the nose cone was getting overly pressurized, and whenever they let the gas out, it would cause the spacecraft to spin out of control, and they ended up essentially going into entry without any attitude control. Anyway, in addition to various vehicle changes, we also had some graphics changes. The new attitude indicator, as seen in the bottom left, is much more useful and actually gives us a better handle on what way the vehicle was pointed, including the roll axis. So this is still flying with a V2 booster, which means it uses the hot staging ring. Pay attention to the top of the hot staging ring. There's a section which doesn't have the grooves cut out. That was added. The reason for this is that as the hot staging happens, the rocket exhaust will pile up against that particular panel and help the booster flip over. At least that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. So the booster performs its flip, starts heading backwards, but they were not going to attempt to recover the booster, right? While they have demonstrated booster recovery and reuse, at this point, since they're moving to the next generation, the V3, they were just interested in pushing this booster to its limits. SpaceX had also published a report on the previous flight which explained why that booster had exploded during its descent. They used a much higher angle of attack, I think it was like 17 degrees relative to the airflow, and that meant that they put much more lateral force on the central downcomer. So that lateral force would have caused the downcomer to sort of sag under the load and essentially break, and that's what happened. So having pushed the limits out and found a re-entry configuration which was clearly beyond the structural limits for their booster design, on this one they wanted to scale things back. Instead of using 17 degrees, they were still going to use more than they'd used on previous flights, but less than the one which they knew was going to destroy their booster. They were also going to test using a different engine configuration, and this is supposed to handle a contingency of what happens if an engine fails during descent. Now, during the landing, they light up a bunch of engines and then dial it back to 3 for the final landing. Well, what if one of those 3 is not operational? Well, there's the second ring of engines that does actually have gimbal capability, so they can switch over to one of those. So this is it coming down through the atmosphere at near supersonic speed. You can see a bit of wiggle going on there, but yeah, it lights up the whole bunch of engines in the middle, performs rapid deceleration, and then dials it back to just 3 engines, with 2 in the center and 1 in the first ring there. So the booster then descended towards the ocean and then pretty much expertly demonstrated that it was able to hover above the ocean, just hanging motionless above the ocean, not falling in exactly the same way that bricks don't. So now there is a bit of a lag between the telemetry and the video, so you can actually see that the rocket exhaust hits the ocean, then they shut the engines off, and then it falls into the water, and there's a big bada boom. Now, to get a better idea of what happened, this is Everyday Astronaut stream. He has his own camera, which is on the right. So you can see, again, the booster shutting down engines, and then it just falls into the water. Now, you might wonder, why did they come to a perfect stop, like 200 meters up, and then fall into the water? And I suspect because it's much easier to sink the booster if it destroys itself on impact. So they demonstrated they could slow it down, and then they let it fall so that they wouldn't have to be trying to sink a booster that was floating around in the ocean like previously. Anyway, the real focus on this flight was, of course, Starship. Starship V2 has never really had a fully successful flight. Well, it continued onwards to orbit as planned. And of course, thanks to Starlink, we got some magnificent imagery all the way up. And you'll notice the Raptors in this view actually have like E5, E6, E3. So these are the engine numbers that correspond to their positions in Starship. You can also read the actual serial numbers on the bells as well. But that's useful because it helps us like orient the camera a little better. Notice that on E6 on the bottom left, you can actually see some hot spot on the engine. We've seen this in previous flights and we've wondered whether it was normal or not. Well, we're still seeing it. It probably is normal. You can see that rear fin casting some cool shadows along the body of Starship. They had launched like an hour or so before sunset, so as they flew out, they were basically flying away from the sun. And now with the engine shut down, we were mainly hoping to see that the booster would remain not in a spinning state. It was nice to see them actually moving the fins immediately to like verify their motion, or maybe fold them away for work on orbit. Remember, this camera is actually sitting out on the end of one of the forward fins. Also, again, make sure to pay attention to the attitude indicator in the bottom right. Also, back of one of the right fin, you can see the tiles that they had attached there. There's already a chunk of tiles missing from the outer portion there. A few days ago when that rolled out to the pad, these tile sections were all roughly the same length, but now we see there's the outer portion missing. Now, my first guess as to why would be aerodynamic reasons, but I'm actually seeing bits of tile getting blown away. So there's tile that has been damaged and remained with it during the launch, leading me to believe that some other process led to some of these tiles being lost. And really, a lot of this flight was going to be about testing various changes to the heat shield. First of all, there were a number of tiles visibly missing intentionally on this. There were tiles with different backing materials. There was apparently like some sort of metal active cooling tile experiment that was going to happen. We weren't clear on exactly where all these things were, but we knew that this thing getting through reentry was going to be like the biggest question for this flight. And certainly early on, soon after reaching orbit, it seemed that there was a lot of debris floating around. Now, there was a question, is this ice that is being liberated? Are these sections of tiles? For example, from this angle, you can see a small stream of material leave the fin root, and then later, in a few seconds, there's a much more substantial amount of material, some of which is very clearly black on one side and white on the other. That definitely feels like it's thermal protection system material rather than ice, because ice would be the same color on both sides as opposed to white on one side and black on the other. And these don't appear to be associated with things like vents or anything. They seem to be sort of random. I would hazard a theory that this booster, the Starship, did get left out in the rain a bit more than previous ones, and so it's possible that water infiltrated certain areas and collected, and as it sublimates in space, it's popping stuff out, carrying it with it. But yeah, it's clear some of these pieces flip, that they are white on one side and black on the other. Anyway, 15 minutes into the flight, was going to be the next big experiment. We were going to test the deployment of their dummy Starlinks, their dumblinks. So this is looking down from the top of the the rack system that stores them. On the right is where the door will be. On the left, you can see a bunch of COPVs, exactly like the one that exploded in Starship 36. So yeah, this is where the door is. Watch that. That's going to be the first thing to move. And also, you see like some clouds floating around. I think that's because they depressurized the nose cone section before they opened the door, so there wouldn't be a massive rush of air. And as you decompress it, you're reducing the air temperature because of expansion of gas, and that means that any moisture in the air is condensing out as clouds. That's actually a really useful thing to have around, because when that door opens properly, any of the residual pressure is going to rush out through the gap that it creates. Yeah, just imagine popping that ship door and then blowing a xenomorph out of it. Well, in this case, we don't have xenomorph. What we have are dumblinks, the Starlinks that are going to get tossed out like giant space pizzas. I hear that SpaceX has a whole thing with the Italian Space Agency to carry payloads to Mars. Well, I mean, it seems to me they could deliver pizzas to Mars. So now that the door is open and you can see straight into the vacuum of space, the actual deployment system is actually pretty slow. They only deploy one at a time. Again, look in the bottom right corner at the attitude of the spacecraft. You can see it's sort of pointing to the north, and that leads me to believe that it's actually pointing with the dorsal section, right? The Pez dispenser direction pointing along its orbit. So these things are going to head out ahead of Starship with a little extra velocity, but not much. And oh yeah, this one that they deployed, it proceeded to bump into the side of the door. That is an unfortunate start to this spacecraft's life, but this spacecraft's life is just going to be terribly short and tragic. It's getting thrown out into a suborbital trajectory. It will burn up in 40 minutes time. It's really too little time for a spacecraft to really appreciate the world. It is tragic, but not nearly as tragic as the fact that they did not put cameras on any of these satellites. I mean, come on, it's only been suggested every day for the last 6 months that we have cameras on this. I know it's nighttime. I don't care. We should have been able to get a photo of this thing in space. This was your one opportunity. We're just going to have to wait until another opportunity, and then that will be the one opportunity. And one day they will actually deliver, and we will be happy. But as for this, yeah, it looks like they're kind of delivering pizzas out the side of things, which does bring me to that whole, like, the nuclear missile silo with the door that says 25 minutes worldwide delivery or your money back. Yeah, but they could actually deliver pizzas like this. It's so efficient. So anyway, this demonstration took some time, and then eventually they were all deployed. It was time to close the door, and they did give us an outside shot of the door closing. So that is, from one of the forward fin cameras, and you can see this tiny sliver of light along the hull of Starship slowly getting smaller and fainter as the Pez dispenser door closes up. Now, the next step on the flight was to verify that they can relight the engines in space. This is essential. They have not gone into orbit, even although the booster and Starship have been capable of it, because they need to demonstrate that once they are in orbit, they can reliably relight the engines in a controlled manner and make sure that they land on the Earth exactly where they want to. They don't want to be like a spent, dumb rocket stage randomly burning up over some point on the Earth. And yes, we got a brilliant, absolutely photogenic engine burn demonstrating this capability. So I'm pretty sure that's the last piece of the puzzle they need before they can actually send this orbital, but they may want future tests. And the next part then is they basically needed to survive re-entry. And again, this had a heat shield with a number of different changes to it. It was not certain that they were going to get all the way through, and this was going to be 20 plus minutes of some very photogenic but very exciting, nerve-wracking, one might say, live coverage of a spacecraft descending through the atmosphere as chunks of it start to disintegrate. And we had a bunch more camera angles since the last time we saw this. We had cameras on all of the fins. We had cameras attached to the back of the fins. Of course, we had cameras in the engine bay. So we got to watch this as it began to break down, and were confident we'd seen it succeed before. But then around 47 minutes in, something happened that made a lot of us feel some serious doubt. You know, my faith was tested when, this happened. It was a fairly energetic explosion which knocked a hole in the skirt. Now, this happened at an altitude of about 90 kilometers, so they would be experiencing some entry heating, but they wouldn't be experiencing huge, dynamic loads. There wasn't any, aerodynamic pressure that was potentially, forcing this through. You'll notice that the debris just kind of was floating around there and not really escaping. It wasn't exactly like falling out into the airstream and getting sucked away. So this wasn't an external force that caused that failure. So now in terms of location, the E5 engine is the one which is lowest, so it sits at the lowest point. The heat shield is basically on the bottom left of this image, and that means the fin on the left side of the rocket is basically lined up where that event happened. Now, we know that this ultimately landed successfully. It wasn't any of the engines exploding. It didn't come from the area above where we've had issues in the attic where there's potentially gas buildup. It doesn't look like a fire. It doesn't look like a pyrotechnic event. The energy density is quite high because it seems to have come from a very small region. One suggestion that is not entirely implausible is that it somehow hit one of the Starlink satellites that it shot out. Well, that would be highly unlikely that it hit that sort of edge-on area, but it's not impossible, and it would sort of be consistent with the kind of observations. There's a big flash of light that's involved, but that could just be as simple as gas escaping and going into the airstream, which was already glowing. If you have a bunch of gas that comes out, it's going to glow a whole lot brighter. Look at the pieces that are floating out there. They are very slowly creating meteor showers. The best I can come up with is that on the early belly flop tests of Starship, there were oxygen vent lines in those regions. So if there was some sort of oxygen or whatever propellant vent system in that region and it got iced up and it built up pressure, or maybe ice flows through the system and hits some corner of the plumbing percussively, that could cause a fairly energetic rupture, which then combined with the gas outside might make something like that. But this really is a mystery. I don't have a good answer for what happened here. Another idea I have is that it might be associated with the hinge, because as we cut back to the outside, the fins are obviously moving from one position to another. If something there at that point seized and perhaps built up a bit of force and then the structure failed, just due to the stresses on it, that might cause something like this, but really it is something of a mystery. And you do have to wait a few minutes to get a view of the fin that is associated with this region, and it is visibly damaged. But here's the thing, the fin on the other side is also noticeably damaged in exactly the same location. Regardless, for all the energy released in this, it was a nothing burger. It apparently didn't cause any changes. And instead, we were much more concerned about these two fins. Again, in this particular region, we saw a lot of damage down there on both sides. I mean, it seemed that wherever the camera was pointed on Starship, we were seeing some evidence of damage, as well as some absolutely beautiful, pretty colours during re-entry. And again, it's been nice to see these since we've missed them for the last few flights. But I'll be honest, I think this was the most photogenic re-entry yet. Not only did we have many, many more angles, but I think the fact that the heat shield had been intentionally crippled beforehand meant that more of Starship was evaporating into the re-entry plasma, giving it all sorts of different colours that we never really seen before, as well as beautiful little sparkling effects as tiny pieces disappeared off. I especially like this one. It felt like the Stargate scene from the end of 2001. And this flow actually makes it much more obvious what direction the booster is travelling, because you can see any sparks and everything shooting off to the top right. Therefore, the bottom left is kind of the direction the spacecraft is moving. About this time, we start to get hints of the horizon ahead of us. Remember, The re-entry starts during the night, but as it passes through into daylight, it crosses, over the day-night terminator, and the landing was going to be in daylight. So we'd be able to get a really good look at what the Starship looked like during the landing. For all the terrible destruction that was befalling the rear fins, the forward fins actually were completely undamaged as far as I could tell. And if you remember, on the very first successful re-entry, it was a forward fin which was getting really eaten up. Well, if you know, on the V2 Starship, these fins have been moved leeward a little, and that has probably helped insulate them against the brunt of the effects. A few minutes later, as we move from night into day, not only can you see the clouds on the ocean below us, if you look carefully, you can actually see the clouds reflected in the shiny stainless steel of the spacecraft. You can also take a look at the attitude indicator, and if you remember, the attitude indicator on previous ones has shown a much steeper angle of attack on this. I think they are intentionally testing a lower angle of attack just to figure out where their performance limits are on this. So presumably this means more light plasma will be coming over the nose of the spacecraft as it descends. It also looks to me that we're starting to see some thermal discoloration of the stainless steel. If you look at the where the Pez dispenser door is and sort of come back towards the camera, there's a section there that is visibly discolored already, and that's just from the heat leaking around the edge of the heat shield. Now this is, stainless steel can be heated to quite high temperatures before it actually loses its structural integrity and melts, but it changes color as this happens. Skipping forward another couple of minutes, that fin is getting seriously degraded, but it's anchored by the hinges that are much further forward. So it turns out that while it looks pretty bad, it's actually still structurally sound. And the onboard system is able to adjust and control the spacecraft regardless. You'll also notice at the top left, you can now see the horizon. That's because the spacecraft is sort of angling itself over. And what this is for is it's able to make cross-range changes. It's basically able to redirect its lift vector, in this case, slightly to the north. So it was adjusting its arrival position slightly to the north, because if you remember, this is actively navigating using aerodynamic forces. It's trying to hit a very small location over the ocean. And it can adjust how far downrange it goes by changing its angle of attack, but it can adjust its cross range by basically pointing to the left or to the right so that it ultimately arrives at the right place. Yeah, and there's some big chunks coming off the back of that fin there. This was so exciting to watch live. I mean, you can see at this point that it's lost 10,000 kilometers an hour, so it's already lost a lot of its orbital velocity, but it's now dipping down to an altitude of about 50 kilometers. So here, the air is getting denser and the drag is increasing. So you see the G-force meter in the bottom right is starting to build up to its peak point. I think it peaks out at about 2.3 G. So this means the dynamic forces on the spacecraft are reaching a peak around this time. Combined with the thermal damage, this is the time when you would expect the spacecraft to be lost. You'll also notice at the fin root, right, the front of that fin, it's actually visibly glowing red now. And you have to appreciate, because the nose is lower down, right, the angle of attack is lower, that's really like the front of the airflow is hitting directly into that section of the fin root. And so what this is really showing is this is the only place where you can actually see what happens when the airflow is directly hitting the surface. You have to imagine the entire underside, the entire heat shield on this giant Starship is probably glowing in a similar manner, even although we can't actually see it due to the camera angle limitations. Also, this camera angle lets us see the pins that are supposed to be used for catching the Starship, or at least the pin re-entry test hardware to make sure that the pins would actually survive your re-entry conditions. So obviously we're going to be paying attention to that in later segments. So now, we're down to Mach 8. We're starting to get to speeds that were achieved by suborbital things like the X-15. It really is through the majority of re-entry. And at this point, with the high G-forces, it's shedding speed very rapidly. we're moving into the point in the flight where it's not the thermal loads that we have to be worried about, it's the structural loads. This is still hot, but it's nothing compared to what it handled previously. So now if we skip forward a few more minutes, we have gone subsonic. This thing is now essentially falling in the belly flop configuration. It's now at an altitude of 30,000 feet, maybe 30 to 5,000 feet. And it's sinking down at, a few hundred kilometers per hour. We can definitely see there's some damage here and there. We can still see bits falling off, the odd bit of thing flapping around. But what I want you to look at is that the front of that fin, remember how it was glowing orange? It is now definitely cooling off, but there is still an orange color there. The rear of the fin, which was glowing bright orange, that has just gone out completely. At this point, we are now cooling the air down. That fin, it survived. Again, we've got this bit of stainless steel at the back, which is just flapping around as if it were tissue paper. That's the kind of forces that we're dealing with. There's a little bit of tile damage right on the leading edge as well, and some of the underlay material just flapping around. So at this point, we knew it had made it through the peak heating. It made it through re-entry. It was still under control. That was a really important part, because if it had too much of the fins that had been damaged, it might not be able to compensate. It might start to lose control here. The big question that everybody had was, what are the state of those engines? We had seen that high energy event, and I mean, you know by now that it survived, but yeah, we were still very concerned. Also, by the way, we were wondering why that particular camera was getting fogged up, and apparently was getting fogged up worse and worse over time. This is a beautiful shot, again, as we're belly flopping towards the clouds. We can actually watch the clouds come up past us. It's really nice because it sort of gives a whole sense of motion for the whole thing. What's also interesting is the attitude indicator is pointed more or less east, which means it's pointed more or less directly at its target. It didn't need to make any more corrections. And so now this is us about to perform the landing burn. And remember, the telemetry is actually running slightly ahead of the real thing. So you see the attitude change here. It actually flips over a lot further backwards than in the previous flight tests. This is because it needs to do this to get captured by the tower. And then, sure enough, yeah, there is the buoy or the buoy in the middle of the ocean with the camera. They were right on target, and they have a spectacular ending to the mission. But wait a second, that Starship doesn't look anything like the thing that we saw launch previously. Where's the glorious black heat shield? It's suddenly turned into an orange rocket, just like that weird unclean SLS thing. I know there's a lot of SpaceX fans out there that are fond of saying how bad orange rockets are, and now their favourite rocket is orange. Why? Well, that is actually another great mystery that I've been trying to figure out. It is uncanny how close that colour seems to match that of the SLS, but I've got a few ideas for what is happening here. So here's a pretty good frame grab. First of all, what you can see is that this is the belly of the Starship. The fins are basically folded up away from us. We can see that it's largely orange towards the bottom. It's white at the top, and then there's a blackish area in between. I've seen a lot of people suggesting that this is perhaps the material underneath the heat shield tiles. The tiles have all gone away, and this is the ablative material that's been left behind. That's a possibility. I'm not sure about that. I personally think that this is some sort of colored deposit that has been added on top of the heat shield tiles. So if we rewind to this moment just before the flip and burn happens, look at the root of the leading edge of the fin, right? There is actually an orange tinge, an orange color on the inside of that. And as you watch this sequence run, you can see that those tiles are still very much attached. There's no missing tiles there. That red stuff apparently is on that tile surface, painted on or whatever, deposited in some form or another. There's another section where if you look along the ridge where you've got the heat shield material and the stainless steel, that it's very obvious there's a sort of red hue that is sitting along that line. Now there is red like glue or silicone glue that's used for holding stuff on there, but this appears to have migrated or been deposited somehow. So that feels like what would happen if you've got some hot gas that's containing some pigment and it's getting trapped in this area. It would be deposited preferentially in these regions just behind the ridge. So that's what I'm thinking. I think that somewhere on the front side there was something that was generating this red pigment of some sort. Now, since we're dealing with a stainless steel rocket, it's entirely possible that one of the places where the tiles was removed is basically corroding away in the heat of the atmosphere or whatever, and that's producing a rust that somehow gets redeposited on top of the tiles. Or it might be there's some other chemical process going on involving the sealants or the adhesives that are used. And if we go back to this image, you can now take a look at the orange section and see that there's actually these like pointy V shapes or inverted V shapes that sort of come to a point somewhere below the flaps, the forward flaps. So since it was kind of going forwards, if you remember the lowish angle of attack, you would expect that if this point, somewhere in there was one particular thing, one experimental heat shield tile, or perhaps missing tile, that was somehow producing hot plasma with some sort of chemical species that is chemically active and produces a red color when it's deposited, it would naturally kind of fan out there. And, you know, I bet you someone is going to figure out the Mach limit where that actually had to happen based upon the angle of that cone. So I suspect that there's plenty of heat shield tiles on there, and that this is actually something just deposited on top of it. You'll also notice, by the way, the top of the rocket is white, and I don't know why that is, although I'm going to point out that this heat shield material is black with a very thin glassy surface, and then underneath that is some sort of like a foamy fibrous white material. Maybe their low angle of attack experiment caused that surface layer to get ablated off at the nose only. Further back, we have the darkish stuff, which is closer to the actual color, and then behind that, you have this weird material that's been produced that's causing this orange color. Again, I don't have really good answers for this. What I do know is that this thing managed to come back from space and perform a successful point touchdown, and that was impressive and awesome in all the best ways. So I can't call this flight anything but a success. There's nothing that didn't work as intended here. Okay, I guess the worst thing was that one of the dumb links bumped its head on the way out. And yes, the lack of cameras. But, you know, the heat shield being a little off, that was sort of entirely expected given the number of experiments that they were doing. This was a fantastic success. I'm really hoping now that we will see a way forward with Flight 11. We have to move forwards to that rapid reuse so that we can start refilling spacecraft on orbit. Congratulations to everyone at SpaceX involved in this feat. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.